Good day, Deep and Word family. Welcome to day 249 of our Bible study review. Today we're going through chapters 29 through 31 of the book of Job. These three chapters are Job's final defense. You have seen how his friends have come up against him three times. They've had three rounds of, knocking him while he's already down. And this is his final defense because he's done talking to them. And so in chapter 29, we see how he recalls. He goes back and he remembers how his life was before all of the tragedy befell. Let's start reading from verse 2. Job says, "Oh, that I were as in months past, as in the days when Elohim watched over me, when his lamp shone upon my head, and when by his light I walked through darkness." Let's pick up in verse 7. He's recalling how his life was right before all of the tragedy. He says, "When I went out to the city gate, and when I took my seat in the square." Now, if you had a seat in the square of the city gate, it meant you had a seat of honor because people would come and gather to hear what you had to say. And he says, "The young men saw me and hid themselves." The young men who were foolish, they hid themselves because they knew they were guilty before his righteous words. And he says, "And the aged rose up and stood up." So even the wise who were older than him, they came to hear what he had to say. And he says right here in verse 9, "The princes refrained from talking and put their hand over their mouth. The nobles held their peace, and their tongues stuck to the roof of their mouth. When the ear heard, then they blessed me. And when they saw, then they approved me." And in verse 12, Job is going to tell you why he had a seat of honor and why he was well respected. He says, "It's because I delivered the poor who cried, and the fatherless, and him who had no help." Job covered the other image bearers. Job loved his neighbor as himself. Let's pick up in verse 15. He says, "I was eyes for the blind, and I was feet for the lame. I was a father to the poor, and I searched out the case that I did not know." He covered those who had no covering, and he was a voice for the voiceless. Verse 21, Job says, "Men listened to me, and they waited, and they kept silence for my counsel." He's recalling the glory days. Now we walk into chapter 30, verse 1, and Job is basically telling you what his life is like now that the calamity has reached his door. He says, "But now those who are younger than me, they mock me. There is no respect for eldership now that they see that he has lost everything." Let's go down to the middle of verse 11. He says, "They have cast off the bridle before me." Now the bridle was put in the mouth of the horse to guide the horse where they needed to go. And so Job was saying, I was a guide to the young men. I was a guide to those who needed guidance. But he says right now in verse 13, "They tear apart my path." So he was one who was guarding and guiding their path, but now they tear apart his path. They promote my calamity. They have no helper. He's saying, I was their help. I was a father to the fatherless, but now they disregard me because they see my condition. They have forgotten who I am. They have forgotten my being because all of the things that were surrounding me. And now that my riches are gone, the external riches, they don't believe that I still hold the richness on the inside. Now we walk into chapter 31, and Job says in verse 1, he says, "I made a covenant with my eyes. Why then should I look upon a young woman?" He's saying, I've made a covenant with my whole being. Although he stands in misery at that moment, he says it would not bring him pleasure to look upon a young, attractive woman, because we know his wife has forsaken him at this point. But he says, that's not going to bring me joy. I've made a covenant with my whole being so that I may stand in right standing with the judge. Right now, I am awaiting his verdict, and so I'm not going to do anything to jeopardize that. Let's go down to verse 3 through verse 6. Job says, "Does not destruction belong to the wicked, and calamity to the workers of iniquity? Does he not see my ways and count all of my steps? If I have walked in vanity, or if my foot has hurried after deceit, let me be weighed in the balance. He's talking about the scales of justice, which is righteousness, and justice, which is the heavenly sign in the 7th month that is in the heavens right now. That has to do with judgment, the final judgment. All right. He says, let me be weighed in the balance if I have walked outside of integrity, if I have done wrong. He says that God may know my integrity. He says, put my life on the balance. Let him be the judge of my integrity. Let's pick up in verses 13 through 15. Job says, if I have despised the cause of my male or my female servant when they complained against me, what then will I do when Elohim rises up? And when he visits, what will I answer him? Did not he who made me in the womb make them also? And did not the same one fashion us in the womb? Job says, if I have done wrong by another image bearer just because they're in a lowly position, he understands that if he is placed in a leadership position or if he is blessed to be a blessing. He says, if I have done wrong by them when they had a complaint, if I didn't seek out their well-being, what is my answer going to be to him who has put his image on them too? Let's pick up in verse 16. He says, if I have kept the poor from their desire or have caused the eyes of the widow to fail. Verse 19, if I have seen anyone perish for lack of clothing or any poor without covering. Verse 21, if I have lifted up my hand against the fatherless when I saw I had help to give them at the gate, then let my arm fall off of my shoulder plate and my arm be broken from my bone. But Job has already proclaimed that that is not his character. That is not what he has done. Let's pick up in verse 35 because this is him pleading for Yahweh to hear his call and to answer him and to close this case. He says, oh, that one would hear me. Behold, my desire is that the Almighty would answer me and that the one who contends against me had written a book. Well, I'm here to tell you that there is a book on Job's life. We're reading it, but I'm here to tell you that there's also a book being written about your life. Who knows? That book may be available for others to read during the millennial reign. We have no idea. We read about Job, we read about King David, we read about Solomon, we read about all of these other people with their flaws and their victories. Is it impossible to think that that book might be published about your life too? My question is, what would you like the possible reader to read about you? Of course, Job did not have the opportunity to edit out certain things. Neither did King David or Solomon. There's some not so great things in there about these characters. It is very possible that that would be true about our lives during the millennial reign, that the flesh and blood during that time will have an opportunity to read the books on our lives. We will be the priesthood. We will be made over at that point, but there might be a library on our lives. And so what would you like the reader to read about you? Would you like them to read how you have overcome everything by the testimony of Yeshua, right? And by following the paths and the commandments of the Father by way of the Spirit, that your life at the very end looked completely different from where you began? Or are you going to be one of those people who confessed Christ but never did anything? You don't look any different. You act the same. You were never truly delivered. Is that the book you want them to read about you? That's not going to be the case with me. And I don't know if this possible book would be published about my life. But if there is, I want to tell you that there's going to be some good things and there's going to be some not so great things in there. None of us had a perfect start. But the truth of the matter is those who follow Christ will have a perfect finish. Give those possible readers of that possible book something good, something victorious to read. Deep in Word family, that's all that I have for you today. Until tomorrow, Yah bless.